We are today on DAF Ayin Tes Amud Aleph. We're at the two dots, and we had seen in the Mishnah that if you have a ditch that divides between two chatzers, so you're not allowed to make an eruv to conjoin those two chatzeros. You have to, each chatzer has to make its own eruv. The exception to that rule is that if you have a plank that traverses the ditch to create a passageway across, so then you can make an eruv between those two ditches. It's like a portal. It's like a portal of entry between those two chatzeros. And the Mishnah had said that the plank has to go across from one side to the other. If you have a ditch that's wider than 4 tfachim and deeper than 10 tfachim. So Amar Rava lo shanu elo shenasan l'rachbo. That requirement that you need a plank of 4 tfachim wide to traverse the entire length or the entire width of the ditch is only true when you're putting the plank across the width of the ditch. If, however, basically the Gemara is telling you you have another option. The other option is to create a diminution of the width of the ditch by placing a plank only on one side along the length of the ditch in such a way where the ditch is now not 4 tfachim wide anymore. The whole reason why the ditch creates a division between the two chatzers is because it's 4 tfachim wide. If you're able to diminish it by placing a plank and propping it up with posts such that you can now jump from one side of the ditch to the other with ease, so then that's also the creation of a portal. And therefore, you don't need to have the plank go all the way across from one side to the other. Okay? So that was that's another option that the Gemara suggests will also work. Okay, let us go weiter.
I mean, 4 tefachim is not very wide.
No,
over it.
That's right. That's why it's considered to be an easy access. Okay, v'shchein shnei gezustro zu keneged zu. Another option that the Mishnah had suggested when you have a ditch of 4 tefachim wide that divides two chatzeros is as if you have two structures on either side of the ditch, and there's a protruding stoop that goes out of the buildings. As long as the two stoops are parallel to each other, such that there's less than 4 tefachim between the two, such that you can jump from one stoop to the other, that also is a portal between the two chatzers, and therefore you can make an eruv with the two chatzeros. But that the proviso is that they have to be actually flush with each other so that you can access from one stoop to the other. So the Gemara now says, Amar Rava, ha de amar zu keneged zu, ein zu shalo keneged zu lo, v'zu l'malo mizunami lo amran, v'zu l'malo zunami, and then you have to maybe stick in a couple of extra words which the Magiim say, right? Basically is that when we say that they have to actually be absolutely flush with each other so that there can be no vertical distance between them or any horizontal distance between the two planks or between the two stoops, that's only true. Lo amran ela sheyesh bein zela zeh shlosha tfachim. That's only when there's more than 3 tfachim between the two. Aval ein bein zela zeh shlosha gezustra akuma hi. But if there's less than 3 tfachim between the two stoops on either side of the ditch, either horizontally or vertically, so then we say basically that we view this as one plank or one access way that's just a little bit bent, but it's really one unit, and therefore that's also enough to conjoin the two chatzeros to allow you to make one eruv. Okay, let's go weiter. The Mishnah now says, matbein shebein shtei chatzeros, gavoa asara tfachim. You have a pile of hay. Now, hay is for horses, right? So you use this as fodder. You can even use this on Shabbos. You have a pile of hay that divides two chatzers, so that there's no access way between one chatzer to the other because of this very tall pile of hay that's 10 tefachim high or more. So the Gemara says, ma'arvin shnayim ve'in ma'arvin echad. So therefore, the two chatzeros cannot join with each other. They have to make separate eruvin. Elu ma'achilun mikan ve'elu ma'achilun mikan. But then the Mishnah tells you a leniency, and it says, but what you are allowed to do is have your animals eat from that hay on Shabbos, and just you have to monitor it. You have to make sure that the hay does not diminish to the pile of hay does not go down to less than 10 tfachim high. Because then if it does, then you're hakdetzaris. Because now you're going to have a breach between two chatzers that did not make an eruv with each other, and neither chatzer will be allowed to carry. If before Shabbos the pile of hay diminishes below 10 tfachim, so then you can only make an eruv for both chatzers, because both chatzers are considered to be one domain. They're completely open to each other, and you cannot make separate eruvim. Let's take a look at the Gemara. Amar Rav Huna uvilvad shelo yiten losoch kupaso v'yachil. Rav Huna tells us a very important proviso. When we said that you're allowed to have your animals eat from this hay on Shabbos, that's only to bring the animals over to the hay and have them nibble on the hay. But to actually use a pitchfork and to take the hay and put it in some kind of container and bring it to your animals, that you're not allowed to do. Why is that? Because we're concerned that you may, since you're taking large quantities of hay from the stack, you may inadvertently lower it below the 10 tfachim mark, and before you realize it, you've created problems for yourself for carrying for each chatzar. And you won't even be aware of it, and you'll end up carrying on Shabbos. So frak the Gemara le'ukmei shari. So you mean to tell me that to bring your animal over to the hay is permissible? Let me show you not that way, because v'hamar Rav Huna amar Rabbi Chanina ma'amid adam es behemto al gabe asavim b'Shabbos ve'in ma'amid adam es behemto al gabe muktzah b'Shabbos. That there is a statement that was made by Rav Huna that a person is allowed to bring his animal over to growing grass on Shabbos. Now we know that animals are allowed to nibble on grass on Shabbos. That's what animals do. That's what cows do. That's what horses do. But you're not allowed to pull out grass, obviously, from the ground. That's a malacha. It's a malacha of tolesh. Are you allowed to lead your animal over to a pasture and have them nibble on grass? Sure, as long as you don't pull out the grass yourself. Are we concerned that maybe by leading them to the grass you'll pull out grass? No, because you know you're not going to do a malacha d'oraisa. But what you're not allowed to do on Shabbos is to bring your animal over to something which is only rabbinically forbidden, such as muktzah. You can't lead your animal over to muktzah, produce on Shabbos, to have them nibble on it, because we're worried that you're going to end up handling the muktzah. Because since it's only a rabbinic prohibition to begin with, we're concerned that you may inadvertently forget the isser and pick up the muktzah yourself and give it to your animal. So the Gemara's question is like this. If you see that we're concerned about you inadvertently disregarding a rabbinic prohibition when it comes to muktzah, why shouldn't we be similarly concerned over here, where you've got a pile of hay that's 10 tfachim high, and you may inadvertently, by leading your animal over to it, cause a nisr d'Rabbanan by having a diminution of the pile, and therefore there'll be an nisr d'Rabbanan of carrying on Shabbos inside the two chatzers. If you're concerned about the nisr d'Rabbanan of muktzah, be concerned about the nisr d'Rabbanan over here as well. That's the Gemara's question. Why should you be allowed to lead your animal over to the hay? Answers the Gemara, the difference between there and here is that over there you're actually schlepping the animal by its reins or whatever apparatus you have to schlep the animal, and you're pulling it over to the muktzah item. That's where we say that you're not allowed to do. Over here, you're not schlepping the animal actively. You're simply obstructing its passage so that it finds itself proximal to the hay. That's all our Mishnah is telling you you're allowed to do. But to mamish schlep it over by the head and put its head by the hay, that you're not allowed to do. V'lo yitein l'soch kupaso teven. And so now let me challenge another statement. The Mishnah, the Rav Huna, you had said that you're not allowed to put the hay into a container and bring to your animal because we're worried that before you know it, you'll have diminished the height of the pile. V'hatanya bayis shebein shtei chatzeros u'mil'uhu teven ma'arvin shnayim ve'ein ma'arvin echad. And then there's a brisa that seems to contradict that. The brisa talks about a similar case. Not when you have a freestanding pile of hay, but rather when you have a barn that divides between two chatzers. The only way to get from one chatzer to the other is by walking through the barn, okay? Now let's say the barn has a pile of hay that completely fills up the barn, so that the passageway is completely obstructed. In that situation, the Brisa says that the two chatzers can only make separate eruvin; they cannot conjoin with each other. And furthermore, the Brisa says that each farmer, the farmers on either side, in each respective chatzer, are allowed to use pitchforks and put the hay into their containers on Shabbos to bring to their animals. Now, this, of course, is the place where we're going. This is the point of the Brisa, which is the challenge to our previous statement, because our previous statement said that you're not allowed to put the hay into containers. You can only let your animal come over to the hay and nibble on it. But we're going to continue this Brisa, and we're going to see other issues that are going to rise up, and which we'll analyze momentarily. If the hay goes below a stack of 10 tfachim, so then both chatzers are going to be prohibited from carrying, because now you've created a breach that opens completely into a different rishus, since now you can't carry anymore. Your chatzer is no longer enclosed as it was before Shabbos. So keitzad hu oseh, noalis beiso mavatalis rishuso, hu aser v'chavero muter. There's only one solution, says the Gemara. If you have two chatzers, or you have one chutzner with multiple residents, and one resident does not participate in the eruv, so what does that person have to do? He's got to lock his door of his house, stay in his house for the rest of Shabbos, and totally be mevatel rishus, which means he's got to make a declaration saying, I hereby relinquish my rights to this chutzner. And by doing so, he's now completely removed his sense of ownership, his owner's stake in the chutzner. This chutzner now becomes unified with the other chutzner and is singularly owned for this Shabbos by the other farmer. So basically, you got two farmers, one on either side of the chutzner. One of the farmers is going to have to be the tzaddik, and he's going to have to say, okay, I'll relinquish all my rights to the chutzner, I'll lock my door, and I won't use my chutzner for the rest of Shabbos. And you, the other farmer, can at least carry in both my chutzner and your chutzner, because it's now one unitary domain.
Right.
Yeah.
He can still walk, though, can he not?
It's not clear, because when it says Noel is Beso, it's mashma that he's got to completely preclude himself from that domain for the rest of Shabbos. That's what Noel is Beso implies. It's not just enough to be Mavatal Rishus, which the Gemara is going to challenge. The Gemara is going to ask, why can't you just be Mavatal Rishus? We'll see that momentarily. And then the last statement of the Brisa is that the same thing is true when you have a ditch that's filled with hay that divides between two tchumen. Now here we're not talking about carrying, here we're not talking about chatzeros. Here we're talking about a different halacha which has to do with tchum Shabbos, with the 2,000 amma boundary. Let's say you have a really, really large ditch, or a really, really large canyon that's between two domains. You got a guy that lives in the east, a guy that lives in the west, and the guy that lives in the east, his 2,000 amas ends right in the middle of this canyon, and the guy in the west also, his domain ends right in the middle of the canyon. But the eastern side of the canyon is within 2,000 amas, and it's filled with hay, and the western side of the canyon is filled with hay, and it's accessible within the 2,000 amas of the guy in the west. What the Bryce is telling me is that each person is allowed to bring his horse or his cow, or whatever it is, over to that canyon or ditch on Shabbos, provided that the animals only nibble from that side of the canyon or the ditch. Okay, that's permissible. So that was the last statement of the Brisa. But the Gemara says, what kasha are we bringing from this Brisa? Ketani miha zenosin l'soch kupaso v'yachil v'zenosin l'soch kupaso v'yachil. You see that from this Brisa, when you have that case of the barn that divides between two chatzers, that you're allowed to fill your container, your trough, with hay and bring it to your animals. Not like Rav Huna had said that you're not allowed to do that, but you're only allowed to bring your animal over to the hay to nibble on it. So what's the reconciliation? So Amri, Bayis Kaven De'ika Tikra Kimivchis Min Karale Milsa, Hachalo Min Karale Milsa. The Gemara says there's a very simple distinction. There's a distinction between a freestanding pile of hay out in the open air versus a pile of hay that's inside a barn. Because the pile of hay is inside the barn, you'll be able to more easily detect that the top of that stack is diminishing. is getting lower, because you'll have a point of reference. You'll compare it to the roof of the barn. You'll say, hey, this stack was much closer to the roof of the barn just a few minutes ago. I better stop taking hay. Whereas if you have a freestanding pile of hay that is not within a structure, it's going to be much harder for you to determine that the line, the top of the stack is actually going down, down, down as you're taking out hay. So therefore, the rabbis were more lenient when you have hay that's inside a structure like a barn, because they realized that you'll be able to be more careful in taking hay and sort of monitoring the height of the haystack. Whereas in a freestanding haystack that's not in a barn, you're not going to be as careful, and therefore they only allow your animals to nibble, and they don't allow you to take it larger quantities and put it in a container.
Is this a Pesik Rishon to Lo Nikolai or no?
No, it's got nothing to do. Pesik Rishon Lo Nikolai is in reference to Malacha. Here we're talking about creating one domain where there were previously two. I don't see that has anything to do with it over here. Nismait hateven me'asar tfachim shneim asurim. Then the Brisa had said that if the haystack goes below the 10 tfachim mark, so now you got tsaris, because now you have one domain where there was previously two, and there was no eruv that was made for both, to incorporate both domains together. So the Gemara now says, ha'asara shari ve'afal gav de midlaya tikra. But what the Brisa does seem to imply is that if the ceiling of the barn is extremely high, as long as the haystack is 10 tfachim high, that's perfectly acceptable. That's considered a separation between the two domains. Shma mina mechitzos shein magios letikra shman mechitzos. So you see from here that if you have a mechitza, even a temporary mechitza like this, that does not go up to the ceiling, it is considered to be a valid divider between two domains. Now, this was the subject of a sugya that we saw in DAF Ayin Beis, where according to Beis Hillel, if you have a very big traklin, if you have a big ballroom or banquet hall, and there are multiple dividers between different people within this large banquet hall, according to Beis Hillel, at least one interpretation of Beis Hillel, is that this is not considered to be a divider between the different individuals such that they can make separate eruvin, because they're all inside one space, and also because the mechitza does not go up to the ceiling. The fact that you have a ceiling overhead indicates that ceiling encompasses everyone together, and it seems not that way from over here. It seems from over here the haystack can go up only 10 tfachim, the ceiling can be 20 feet high, and yet that is considered still to be a divider between the two domains. So that seems to contradict at least one opinion that we saw in Daf Ayin Beis. How do you reconcile it? So the Gemara says, Amar Abaye, Hacha Babaye Shlosha Asar Chaser Mashu Askinon B'Teven Asara. So Abaye says, you're right. In order to reconcile it, you have to say that the Brisa is talking about a case where the ceiling of the barn is not so high, but rather how high is it? It's only a little bit less than 13 tfachim high. So you have basically less than 3 tfachim between the top of the haystack and the ceiling of the barn. And you basically say lavud. You say that the distance between the two is inconsequential, and that's why it's considered to be a valid divider between the two chatzers. And v'Ravuna Bereid Rav Yeshua Amar afilu tema bebayis asara v'teven shiva umashu v'chol pachos mishlosha kilav udami. And Ravuna Bereid Rav Yeshua goes even further. He says, in that scenario, when you're dealing with a barn, then you don't even need a haystack that's 10 tfachim high. You could have a haystack that's just slightly higher than 7 tfachim, as long as the barn's height, the ceiling of the barn is 10 tfachim high. In that scenario, since you've got less than 3 tfachim between the top of the haystack and the ceiling of the barn, you could say love it in that case as well, and you wouldn't even need to have a haystack that's 10 tfachim high. It just has to be a little bit over 7 tfachim, and you say lavud. So the Gemara now says, Bishlam alei abaya hainu de ketani me asara, elo the Ravuna Bereid Rav Yeshua mai me asara. So the Gemara says, the language of the Brisa is more indicative like Abaya, because the Brisa says that if the top of the stack goes lower than 10 tfachim, then you got problems. According to Rav Huna Berei de Rav Yeshua, it shouldn't say if it goes less than 10 tvachim, it should say if it goes less than 7 tvachim. So how do you reconcile the language of the Brisa to Rav Huna Berei de Rav Yeshua? The Gemara answers Mitar Asasara, that he would learn that the Brisa means that if the haystack the top of the haystack goes lower than having a din of 10 tvachim high, meaning the haystack is really only 7 tvachim in a mashu and a little bit. But the reason why it has the status of 10 tvachim is because it's lavud to the ceiling of the barn. So if it goes any lower, so that it no longer has the din of 10 tvachim, so then you got saras. So therefore, you can't derive anything from the language of the brisa. Let's go weiter. Shneihen asurin. If the stack goes lower than 10 tvachim, then both sides will be aser. Shma mina diurin haboin b'shabes asurin. So the Gemara says you can make another inference which contradicts a previous Gemara. Now this previous Gemara we had seen all the way back in the beginning of Eruvin on DAF Yud Zayin. The Gemara talked about the following scenario. When you have a karfeif is an empty lot that's enclosed. And we said that in order to be allowed to make an eruv in this karfeif, you have to make sure that there's no significant empty, unused space within that lot on Shabbos. And the Gemara's criterion was basically one person uses 2 sa'as worth of space. So if you have 2 people, you can have an empty lot of 4 sa'as. If you have 3 people, you can have an empty lot up to 6 sa'as. But more than that, you can't have because then you're going to have too much empty space, and since it's not used, it's not occupied, then it prevents you from having an eruv on Shabbos. It has to be mukaf lidira. It has to be occupied space, occupied territory. So in any event, the Gemara then asks a question. What happens if over the course of Shabbos you started, let's say, with 3 people, and you have a lot that is 6 sa'as large, and you have 3 people who make the Eruv, and therefore it's a duly constituted hukaf l'dira karfeif. What happens if one person dies in the middle of Shabbos? So now you only have 2 people that are occupying a very large space. Is it still permitted to carry? So there was one opinion in the Gemara that said, yes, as long as at the inception of Shabbos, the whole space was hukaf l'dira, even if that status changes over the course of Shabbos, you stick with whatever status was at the inception of Shabbos. Here the Gemara seems to say that status can change based upon changing circumstances. So that even though it was permitted for either side to carry in their respective chatzers, now that a breach has formed in the wall in between the two, neither side is allowed to carry because physical circumstances changed over the course of Shabbos. That seems to be a contradiction to that opinion that we saw previously. So the Gemara says, Dilma di'im et me esmol, that you'd have to say that according to that opinion, we're not talking about where the haystack lowered less than 10 tvachim on Shabbos, but rather the haystack lowered before Shabbos, so that even at the inception of Shabbos, you did not have a duly constituted partition between the two, and therefore the Eruvin were never kosher. Okay, Ketzad hu osa noel espesu mevatel rishusa. So what should one of the farmers do? The farmer who wants to be the tzaddik, he should go ahead, he'll sacrifice his own usability of the chutzner so that the other farmer will be able to traverse both chutzers. And what he's got to do, he's got to lock his door so he can't go outside, and then he's got to say, I hereby nullify my rights to my chutzner. So tarti, so the Gemara says tarti, it's a question mark. Why do you need to have both? Like Alan was curious, like l'chora, all you need to do is be mevatel rishus, and that should be sufficient. So the Gemara says, you're right. Hachi kamer, o noel es beso, o mevatel es rishusa. You really only need one or the other. Either you lock your door and say, and basically physically do not use your chutzner for the rest of Shabbos, or if you want to walk outside, then you have to make a declaration of being mevatel rishus and say, I'm really just a guest in this chutzner for the rest of Shabbos. V'iba is ema. I'll give you another shot. La'olam tarte kevin dedash be asilatil tulei. That here there's a special chumrah that the chachamim made. Why? Why do you need both over here, where in other circumstances you only need to do one? The answer is because it's his own backyard. When you deal with someone's own backyard, he's so used to walking there and using it as a regular utility space, if you don't place the 2 requirements on him, he may end up carrying on Shabbos because he's so used to it. And that's why the rabbis over here said you got to do both. You got to both lock the door and physically sequester yourself from the chutzner, and you've also got to make a declaration of bittul rishus. I divest my ownership. Let's go weiter. Hu aser v'chavero mutter. It's aser for you, therefore, to carry outside in the chutzner, but your friend is allowed to carry the other farmer. So the Gemara says, Pshita. Isn't that obvious? Why did the Beraisa have to spell that out? Lo tzricha dahadr idach ubatolei lechavre v'hakamash malandein mevatlin v'chozun mevatlin. The answer is that the Gemara, the Beraisa wants to convey the following point. That the farmer A, who's the tzaddik, right, he went ahead and locked his door, was mevatel rishus. So the other farmer may say, listen, I feel guilty. Why should I take advantage of this guy? We'll make a deal. You, for the first half of the Shabbos day, you locked yourself in and were mevatel rishus. You know what? I'll do it for the other half of the day, and that way, for the second half of the day, you'll get to be able to use both chutzers freely as you wish. The Brisa says you can't do that. You can't do that. No. You can't be mevatel rishus. You can't switch off.
You're changing status.
You're changing status mitten Shabbos. You can't do that. So the Brisa wants to communicate to you that as nice as that sounds from a neighborly standpoint, it's not going to work halachically. If once one guy's mevatel rishus, you can't take back that rishus and have the other guy be mevatel it. Okay. V'chenat omer begov shel tevin sheben shnei tchumei Shabbos. We say the same thing. That was the last line of the Brisa, is that if you have a ditch or a canyon between two domains, and the guy in the east can take the straw that's within his 2,000 amas, and the guy in the west can take the straw that's within his 2,000 amas, and we're not worried that your animal may go a little bit further and go beyond the 2,000 amas. So pshita, isn't that obvious? Once you tell me the halacha by chatzeros, which is a rabbinic law of eruvin, wouldn't I normally apply that to the laws of tchumen as well? So the Gemara says no. Lo tzricha Rabbi Akiva da amar tchumen deoraisa. Ma'u detema ligzor dilma'asi lichlu fe'kamash malon. Recall that there was a das yachid of one Tana, that which is Rabbi Akiva, who holds that the laws of tchumen are deoraisa. They're not rabbinic law like ERU chatzeros, but rather it is a biblical prohibition to trespass beyond your 2,000 amas on Shabbos. And what the Brisa is telling me is that even according to Rabbi Akiva, who holds that tchumen is deoraisa, he will still hold that it's permissible for you to have your animal nibble on the hay that's inside the canyon, as long as your animal stays within the 2,000 amas, even though the hay goes well beyond the 2,000 amas in the canyon. Because even according to Rabbi Akiva, we're not concerned. You'll be careful. You'll make sure that you don't trespass beyond the 2,000 amma point. Let's go on to the next Mishnah. Keitzad mishtatfin b'mavoi. What are the mechanics of actually making an eruv for the residents of a mavoi? Now, I just want to remind you of the terminology. The word shituf and the eruv are synonymous words. It's really an artificial distinction. The rabbis wanted to distinguish between making an eruv. The term eruv is used for chatzers. The term shituf is used for mavois. But they basically mean the same thing, which is to create a singular corporate entity for the mavoi or for the chatzeros. So here we're talking about creating an eruv for the mavois, and we call that shituf. So how do you make the shituf for the mavoi? So we had said before that every member of the mavoi has to contribute food. But that sometimes would be cumbersome. It's a burden to have everyone contribute something and put it in a container. What another option that the Mishnah is going to tell us is that one person can take a barrel of food or produce or beverage, and he can actually designate every single member of the mavoi as being a partial owner, a partner in the ownership of the contents of this barrel. Okay, he's allowed to do that. But there's a mechanical process to make a kinyan such that every single member of the mavoi becomes an owner. You can't just make a declaration. I can't make a declaration. Even if this is my sefer, I can't say, Alan, this sefer is now yours. That doesn't work. You have to make a kinyan, or your proxy has to make a kinyan. So the Mishnah is now going to tell us how that works over here. That what you can do is, you take a barrel, you put it down, and you say, the contents of this barrel hereby belongs to all of the members of the mavoi. However, umizaka lahen al yedei beno uvito hagdoilim, val yedei avdo v'shivchaso ha'ivrim, val yedei ishto. But it's not just enough to make the declaration. Someone who represents the other members of the mavoi actually has to make a physical kinyan by taking possession of the barrel. So who can you use? You can use anyone, because we have a principle of zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav. You can create merit to a person by appointing a proxy who's doing the other guy a favor. He doesn't even have to know about it. And his proxy is still a proxy as long as he's doing him something good. So here I can use anyone that's accessible to me in my household. I'm going to take my barrel of wine, and I'll say to my child, my bar mitzvah boy or my bat mitzvah girl, or I'll say to my Hebrew servant, or I'll say to my wife, pick up the barrel and make a kinyan on behalf of all the members of the mavli. Perfectly fine. Aval eino mezaka lo al yedei beno uvito haktanim v'lo al yedei avda v'shivchaso hakananim mipnei sheyadan ki yado. The only thing that you're not allowed to do is that you're not allowed to have someone who, by them picking it up, it does not separate the barrel from you. You have to appoint someone who, when they pick it up, they're actually distinct from you, such that their kinyan is a valid kinyan that is separate from you. But there are certain people that when they pick something up, it's as if you picked it up yourself. For example, if I have a child who's under bar mitzvah, the halacha is anything that child is kaina, I'm automatically kaina. If my son goes and finds something on the street, he finds a $20 bill on the street, it belongs to me. That's not until he becomes bar mitzvah. Once he becomes bar mitzvah, he gets to keep it. Sorry, Shlomo, you got to give me everything that you find, right? So, no. There's a halacha that whatever she brings into the marriage, she has to give to her husband. Whatever she earns during the course of the marriage, she has to give to her husband. But it's not an automatic principle. No, it doesn't work that way. A woman can be kona things independently of her husband, right? So, same thing with an Eved Kanani. Whatever he acquires, his yad, his hand is like my hand. So whatever he picks up, it's like I picked it up. So therefore, for him to pick it up is completely ineffective. It hasn't created a distinct kinyan apart from myself, and therefore I can't use those to make the kinyan on behalf of the members of the mavli. Amar Rav Yehuda Chavish shel shitufei mavu as tzarich lahagbiya min hakarka tefach. So Rav Yehuda tells us another requirement, and that is the barrel of wine that you're going to be using for the ERU, for the mavui, has to be lifted up off the ground at least one tefach. Tosfos points out that for other kinyanim you need to lift it off the ground more. It's just that we're lenient when it comes to the laws of Eruvin because it's only a rabbinic law that all you need is a minimum of one tefach. But for other things, sometimes you have to lift it up even higher off the ground. So you can't extrapolate from here to other cases. Amar Rava, Hani tarte mili sabi de pumpadisa amrinu. So Rava says, the elders of Pumpadisa taught me two things. And the Rashi says the elders of Pumpadisa are Rav Yehuda and his yeshiva in Pumpadisa. What were the two things? Chadaha, the first one was this halacha that you got to lift the barrel off the ground one tefach. And idach, hamakadesh im tomalo lugmav yatzav im lav lo yatzav. The second thing is that when you make Kiddush Friday night or Yantif night, you have to have you have to drink a cheekful of wine in order to be Yotzei Kiddush. The poskim debate how much a cheekful is, but the consensus is that's the majority of a revius. And in order to be Yotzei Kiddush, that's how much you have to drink. Amar Rav Chaviva ha nami sabi de Pumpadisa amrinu. Rav Chaviva says, I learned something else from the elders of Pumpadisa, which is the Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Osin Medura L'chaya B'Shabbos, that if a woman is in labor, and there's a danger to her bodily safety, then you're allowed to make a bonfire for her on Shabbos. You're allowed to be Mechal Shabbos for her medical safety. Savr mino l'chaya in l'chololo, and b'mos ha'geshamim in b'mos ha'chamalo. It wasn't clear how to extrapolate that halacha. Some people thought that when that statement was made, it was only a special dispensation for a woman in labor. But let's say a person feels ill and he gets the chills. Maybe for that person, you're not allowed to make a bonfire. And also, it wasn't clear. Maybe this heter is only when it's cold outside, like in the winter. But if it's a hot, sunny day and the woman in labor gets the chills, you're not allowed to make a fire for her. So Amar Reb Chia bar Abba Amar Shmuel, and therefore the clarification was said by these Amoraim that Heikis Dam v'nitzdanein oslo medura b'Shabbos v'afilu b'tekufas tamas. That even if a person just had a bloodletting before Shabbos and then Friday night he gets the chills, So then, because you perceive that there may be a sakana here, you're allowed to make a fire for that person on Shabbos, even if it's in the middle of the summer. Even if it's the hottest day of the year, you're still allowed to do it, because this guy has the chills. Now, we know there's still a certain ambiguity in this sugya, because we're dealing with a chola sheyesh bo sakana or a chola she'ein bo sakana. That's not something that we'll discuss for now, but just the general rule is that for a chola sheyesh bo sakana, you're allowed to be machal Shabbos even d'oraisa. But for a chola she'ein bo sakana, the general rule is that you can only do d'rabanans, you can't do d'oraisas.
What's the English for that, Rabbi? I didn't understand the Hebrew.
A chola sheyesh bo sakana is that a sick person who is deathly ill, meaning that there's a danger to their life, to life or limb. Chola she'ein bo sakana is that a person is ill, but there's no danger to life or limb. There's just a tremendous discomfort and the feeling the person is sick. Okay, Amar Ameimer Hanami Sabi to Pumpadisa Amrinu. Ameimer says the following was also stated by the elders of Pumpadisa. I'm not really clear on why the Gemara Dafka over here refers to Rav Yehuda and Shmuel as the elders of Pumpadisa. They're so ubiquitous throughout Shas. There must be some specific designation over here as to why they're called the elders of Pumpadisa. Perhaps because these halachas are big chidushim having to do with Shabbos and Yantav and their special heterim that they give or special requirements that they give, and that's why they're given this special honorific title. The Itmar, as it was stated, Ezohi Asherah Stam. The statement was made, what is the definition of an Asherah tree? Which means we know that the Torah prohibits a certain kind of tree that is designated for idolatry. It's called an Asherah tree. Now, how do you know, if you see a tree in the Middle East that is used by heathens, how do you know if it has the status of an Asherah tree? How do you know it's being used for idolatry or not? What are the indicators? So Amarav, as you know, obviously if it has a sign that says Asherah tree, then you know. But what if it doesn't say? What if there's no marking or designation? Is there a way to tell? So Amarav, Kol shekormin shomrinosa ve'ein toam in miperosea. So Rav says that if you see the priests of a certain religion, idolatrous religion, are guarding the tree and they never take any of the fruit for personal consumption, so then you know it's an Asherah tree. Shmuel is even more machmer. Shmuel says, Amar kagon da amri hani tamari l'shichra devei natzrufi d'shasulei biyom edam. That he says that even if they do consume the dates, but they say that they're going to save the dates for a special holiday called the Natsrafi, which is the name of an idolatry that was known in the Middle East at that time, and they say they're going to use it for that for that holiday of the Natsrafi religion, and they're going to use it to make beer to drink on that day. So then you know that that tree is also an Asherah tree, because otherwise they wouldn't seclude the dates specifically for drinking or consuming on that date. But and Rav Yehuda taught us that the halacha in this respect is like Shmuel, that you're even more machmir by the Asherah tree. Just going to go a few more lines and then we'll be done. Meisvei, so the question is raised, Ketzad mishtatfen b'mavoi. This is a kasha on the halacha that you have to lift up the barrel one tefach high. The Brisa says, how are you supposed to make a shituf in a mavoi? Meviim chavish shel yain v'shel shemen v'shel tamar v'shel grogros v'shel shemini peiros. You bring over a barrel that is filled with either wine or oil or dates or figs or other kinds of produce. Im mishalo tzarach lezakos v'mishalahen tzarach lahodia. If it belongs to you, you create a zikoy. You give over portions of ownership to all the members of the mavoi. If it belongs to the other members of the mavoi, meaning that they actually are owners of the contents, then you at least have to inform them before you designate this as an eruv, because if a person has something that's a food item of theirs and they specifically say that I don't want it as an eruv, then that precludes the eruv from taking effect. Umagbia min hakarka mashu. And then you only have to lift the barrel off the ground a slight amount in order to make the kinyan. So what do you see from here? You see from here that you don't have to lift up a tefach, just a mashu is sufficient. Mashu is just the slightest amount. So the Gemara says, no, my mashu nami to kamar tefach. That when the Brisa says mashu, it just means a minimal amount, which we are defining now as one tefach. So it's not a contradiction. You do have to lift it off the ground, the tefach, in order for the eruv to take the effect as being owned by all the members for the sake of an eruv. Have a wonderful day.